Hi, everybody. I'd like to discuss with you some thoughts I've been pondering regarding improvisers, more specifically, three types of improvisers. In the way I see it, I mean, there are basically three schools or three categories of improvisers, and I've identified them as being traditionalist, modernist, and experimentalist. So, traditionalist, modernist, and experimentalist. Mind you, there are many subcategories in hybrids, but I think many can agree that most fall within one of these three areas. So let's look at the first, uh, the traditionalist. These are musicians whose work is brought to fruition using ideas and concepts from the past. Typically, their work is more accessible, aesthetically non offensive, and tends to fall within a past tradition of aesthetic norms and creative behaviors. Other ways to define a traditionalist musicians whose work is customary, long standing, and habitually done. Uh, the second category, the modernist. Modernist are those whose work reflect present time beliefs, thoughts, and creative tendencies. Now, the modernist is often inspired by tradition, and their work can be easily identified as belonging to an earlier, more conventional musical practice. In other words, their musical roots can be easily traced. Now, other ways to define a modernist, musicians whose works sound present day, musicians whose works sound up to date, or musicians whose works sound traditionally refurbished. And I really like that word refurbished. And, think, a couch that's kind of worn or an old couch and that you want to give a new look. You would refurbish that couch. However, the you might say the roots of it is still, something from the past. So that's sort of how I came up with that term. Uh, the third category, the experimentalist. Now, these are musicians whose work is brought to fruition using innovative, untested, and oftentimes exploratory ideas. Now, in some cases, many of their ideas never existed before they created them. So, again, many of their ideas never existed before they created them. Now, unlike modernists, experimentalists, their work can't always be traced to an identifiable beginning. Because unlike the modernists, tradition as we've defined it here is not always a creative starting point. Okay? Now, other ways to define the experimentalist, um, musicians whose music sounds investigational, musicians whose music sounds probing or radical. Now, a simpler way or a more succinct way to look at this, um, modernists tend to look to the past. I'm sorry, traditionalists tend to look to the past. Modernists look to current trends and thoughts, and experimentalists tend to look to the future. So traditionalists tend to look to the past, modernists tend to look to current trends and thoughts, and experimentalists tend to look to the future. And and let me sort of unpack the part about experimentalists looking to the future. So to think about when someone is sort of falling within this definition of the experimentalist, oftentimes they're creating things that are usually ahead of their time. So therefore, people may not even catch up to what they're doing until maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So in essence, they are creating something for the future, even though they may not be thinking in those terms during the actual creating process. Now, something else to think about. Now, depending on the times that the person is living in, their, you might say, their arrangement of aesthetic progressiveness will actually change. Think about this. There was a time when Charlie Parker's music was perceived as, ultra modern or even experimental by some. Now, you can hear his music played, as background music at Starbucks. And I don't mean to say this in a condescending way, but it just really reinforces that creative and aesthetic tolerances do change. Not too long ago, I heard saxophonist Peter Bronsman at the Vision Festival. And what struck me actually is that his playing actually didn't really sound that experimental. It sounded more like edgy modern. And I mean, for me, I attribute this to hearing just on a maybe weekly, monthly basis, just a lot of younger generation of experimentalists in New York who are, I feel, are pushing the music to more aesthetic extremes. So therefore, when I hear someone who's not really doing that, it doesn't really sound as experimental as maybe it once did. And so what happens is that the aesthetic goalpost actually can be moved. Okay, so what once sounded experimental at one time or radical doesn't always sort of remain that way. So anyway, those are just my thoughts. And again, as I said at the beginning of this, there are certainly all of these subcategories and hybrids, that musicians fall into. So it's not always as easily categorized, but it does provide a jumping off point, at least to have a conversation about it. But anyway, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you the next time. All right, goodbye.